All right, let's get started. Oops, wrong one. Let's go here. All right, sounds good. All right, the growth of anti-imperialism. The colonial system was the spinal cord of the commercial capitalism of the mercantile epoch. In the era of free trade, the industrial capitalists wanted no colonies at all, least of all the Caribbean. The trend dated back, as we have seen, to the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Its development paralleled the development of the free trade movement. The whole world became a British colony, and the Caribbeans were doomed. The leader of the movement was Cobden referred approvingly to Adam Smith's chapter in his, quote, immortal work on the expense of colonies. To him, the colonial question was a financier question. The colonies were expensive. Encumbrances, making dazzling appeals to the passions of the people, serving only as, quote, gorgeous and ponderous appendages to swell our ostensible grandeur, but in reality to complicate and magnify our government expenditures without improving our balance of trade. He could see nothing but a monstrous impolicy in sacrificing our trade with a new continent of almost boundless extent of rich territory in favor of a few small islands with comparatively exhausted soil. In 1852, the British declared war on Burma and annexed Lower Burma. Cobden protested. He wrote an article entitled "How Wars Are Got Up in India," suggesting that Britain ought, quote, to advertise in the Times for a governor general who can collect the debt of £1,000 without annexing a territory, which will be ruinous to our finances. To Molesworth, one of the outstanding colonial reformers, Britain's colonial policy was motivated by, quote, an wild desire of worthless empire, as on the frontier of the Cape of Colony in South Africa, where, quote, the loss of an axe and 2 goats has cost this country a couple of million sterlings. Australia was a collection of communities, the offspring of convict immigration. New Zealand was a constant headache with its, quote, imbecile governors, discreditable functionaries, and unnecessary wars with the natives. South Africa was a huge, worthless, and costly empire extending over nearly 300,000 square miles, chiefly rugged mountains and arid deserts, the barren plains without water, without herbage, without navigable rivers, without harbors, in short, without everything except the element of great and increasing expenses to this country. In charge of this diverse and heterogeneous collections of colonies was the colonial secretary, traversing and retraversing in his imagination the terraquotta globe, flying from the Arctic to the Antarctic pole, hurrying from the snow of North America to the burning regions of the tropics, rushing across the fertile island of the Caribbeans and the arid desert of South Africa and Australia, like nothing on earth or in romance save the wandering Jewish person. The cost of protecting this empire was 1/3 of Britain's export trade to the colonies. Colonial independence was cheaper. The colonies should be free from the ever-changing, frequently well-intentioned but invariably weak and ignorant despotism of the colonial office. Hume, another radical politician, joined in the attack on, quote, Mr. Mother Country, removed the iron chains which fettered the best exertion of the colonies. Let them manage their own affairs instead of being kept in leading strings and subjected to the fluctuating management of Downing Street. The Colonial Office is a nuisance and should be locked up. Trusteeships was out of fashion. Roebuck, a freelance radical, imposed a cant the humanitarian refusal to surround the colonies to the local self-governments. History taught that the S words must disappear in the face of the relentless advance of the superior race. Justice and humanity must yield to the iron law and of an unjust necessity. James Stephen, the famous permanent undersecretary of the Colonial Office, never wavered in his discrimination not to lay down the, quote, wretched burdens which in an evil hour we assumed. But the capitalists like Taylor, also of the Colonial Office, could see in the colonies nothing but furious assemblies, foolish governors, missionaries, and slaves, which, in the words of Merivale, were to be restrained for the mere, quote, pleasure for the governing them, for pleasure of governing them. Nothing was true but what went to the Caribbean's condemnation. Nothing was just but what went to the Caribbean ruin. It seemed to the desperate planters as if the coalition had been formed to destroy the colonies. The assemblies of Jamaica and British Guiana went on strike in 1838 to 1840 and refused to vote supplies. Jamaica preferred Yankee Doodle to God Save the Queen. Who cared? Members of Parliament were prepared to barter the Caribbean islands to America for a slight compensation. Jamaica to the bottom of the sea, Thunder Roebuck, and all the Antilles after it. These barren colonies had been a source of nothing but war and expenditures. They have ever been the most fatal appendages of the British Empire, and if they were to be blotted out from the face of the earth, Britain would lose not one jot of her strength, one penny of her wealth, one instrument of her power. It was an endemic. Even Disraeli, an arch imperialist of later decades, was infected. In 1847, the forlorn Antilles were still to him a fragment which I value of the colonial system of England. 6 years later, Canada had become a diplomatic embarrassment, and the wretched colonies a Damnosa Herodotus milestone around Britain's neck. In 9 cases out of 10, according to Gladstone, it was impossible to secure parliamentary attention to colonial concerns, and in the 10th case, it was only obtained by a casual operation of party spirit. The age of empire was dead. That of free traders, economists, and calculators had succeeded, and the glory of the Caribbeans was extinguished forever. Only another 30 years before, however, the tune would change. But the Caribbean Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Okay. C. The growth of world sugar production. Doo-doo-doo-doo. The strength of the British sugar islands before 1783 lay in the fact that, as sugar producers, they had few competitors. Insofar as they could, they would permit none. They resisted the attempt to introduce the cultivation of sugar and cotton into Sierra Leone, on the ground that it would be a precedent to foreign nations who have as yet no colonies anywhere. but might prove detrimental to those who possessed the Caribbean colonies. Just as a century previously they had opposed the cultivation of indigo in Africa. Their chief competitors in the sugar trade were Brazil and the French islands, Cuba being hampered by the extreme exclusiveness of Spanish mercantilism. This situation was radically altered when San Domingue forged ahead in the years immediately following the secession of the mainland colonies. The cultivations of Barbados and Jamaica had transferred the sugar trade of Europe from Portugal to England. The progress of San Domingo gave control to the European sugar market to France. Between 1750 and 1789, French imports from the colonies multiplied 11 times. French colony products re-exported abroad 10 times. In 1789, two-thirds of French exports to the Baltic, over one-third of the exports to the Levant, were colonial produce. It was, quote, by it and by it alone that she turned the balance of the trade with all the world to the favorable result. It was the old law of slave production at work. Saint Domingo was larger than any British colony. Its soils was more fertile, less exhausted. Hence, its costs of production were lower. This difference in costs of production became an object of particular inquiry with the Privy Council Committee in 1788. From the standpoint of the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, this was the decisive factor. The age of the British sugar islands was over. The West Caribbean island system was unprofitable, and the slave trade on which it rested, instead of being very advantageous to Great Britain, is the most destructive that can be well imagined to her interest. For a prime minister whose father had been constantly on the Caribbean island side of the fence and whose predecessor, a mere 10 years previously, had blandly turned down the petition for abolition, this was a monumentous conversion. Pitt turned to India. Pitt's plan was twofold: to recapture the European market with the aid of sugar from India, and to secure the international abolition of slave trade, which would ruin San Domingo, and not international abolition than British abolition. The French were so dependent on British slave traders that even an unilateral abolition by England would seriously dislocate the economy of French colonies. Pitt's plan failed for two reasons. The importation of East Indian sugar on the scale planned as was impossible owing to the high duties imposed on all sugar, not the produce of the British West Caribbeans. Lord Hawkesbury, for the Caribbean West monopolist, imposed the alteration of the existing law in favor of the monopolizing company, which was exceeding the bounds of its charter. But Hawkesbury was more than a Caribbean. He was in close touch with British commerce and industry, especially Liverpool. He therefore recommended instead the importation of all foreign sugar, provided it was done in British ships and solely for refining and re-export. The commerce and shipping of France would be more diminished, and the commerce and shipping of Great Britain more augmented than by any single measure has been pursued for the last century. By this very simple regulation, Britain would recover the sugar trade she had enjoyed from 1660 to 1713, but which thereafter she lost to France. Secondly, the French, Dutch, and Spaniards refused that with what Lord Liverpool called 30 years later sheer perseverance to abolish the slave trade. It was not difficult to see the political motives behind Pitt's cloak of humanitarianism. Gaston Martin, the well-known French historian of the slave trade in the Caribbean colonies, accused Pitt of aiming by propaganda to free the slaves in the name, no doubt, of humanity, but also to ruin French commerce, and concludes that in the philanthropic propaganda there were economic motives, which explain the liberty with which Britain put funds at the disposal of the French abolitionists, and the way in which France was swamped in translation with the anti-slavery work of the British abolitionist Clarkson, as Ramsay had admitted. We may confidently conclude that the African trade is more confined in its utility than is generally imagined, and that of late years it has contributed more to the aggrandizement of our rivals than of our national wealth. At this juncture, the French Revolution came to the aid of Pitt, fearful that the idealism of the revolutionary movement would destroy the slave trade and slavery. The French planters of San Domingo in 1791 offered the island to England, and they're soon followed by those of the Wayward Islands. Pitt accepted the offer when war broke out with France in 1793. Expeditions after expeditions was sent unsuccessfully to capture the precious colony, first from the French, then from black people. It was not, Parliament was assured, a war for riches or local aggrandizement, but a war for security. The Allied cause in Europe was weakened in the interest of British imperialism. The secret of England's impotence for the first 6 years of the war, writes Fortescue, historian of the British Army, may be said to lie in the two fatal words, Saint Domingo. Britain lost thousands of men and spent thousands of pounds in an attempt to capture Saint Domingo. She failed, but the world's sugar bowl was destroyed in the process of French colonial superiority, smashed forever. For this, writes Fortescue, England's soldiers had been sacrificed, her treasures squandered, her influence weakened, her arm for 6 fateful years, fettered, numbed, and paralyzed. This is of more than academic interest. Pitt could not have had San Domingo and abolished slave imports a year. San Domingo might as well have been at the bottom of the sea. The very acceptance of the island meant, logically, the end of Pitt's interest in abolition. Neutrally, he did not say so. He had already committed himself too far in the eyes of the public. He continued to speak in favor of abolition, even while giving every practical encouragement to the slave trade. But it was not the old Pitt of 1789 and 1791, the Pitt of Latin tags, brilliant oratory, and infectious humanitarianism. The change can be followed in the debates in Parliament, in the Wilberforce Diary. In 1792, Wilberforce Diary struck the first ominous note. Pitt throughout against slave motion in San Domingo account. Thereafter, Pitt's support of Wilberforce annual motions became nothing short of perfunctory. On one occasion, he supported the Caribbean. On another, he put off the motion. On another, he stood stiffly by Wilberforce. On yet another, he simply stayed away. Under Pitt's administration, the British slave trade alone more than doubled. Britain conquered 2 more sugar colonies, Trinidad and British Guiana. As the abolitionist Stephen wrote with bitterness, Mr. Pitt, unhappily for himself, his country, and mankind, is not zealous enough to the cause of black people to contend for them as decisively as he ought in the cabinet any more than in the Parliament. Liberal historian pled Pitt's fear of Jacobinism Jacobitism. The real reason is more simple. It can be taken as axiomatic that no man occupying so important a position as Prime Minister of England would have taken so important a step of abolishing the slave trade purely for humanitarian reasons. A Prime Minister is more than a man, he is a statesman. Pitt's reasons were political and only secondarily personal. He was interested in the sugar trade. Either he must ruin San Domingo by flooding Europe with cheap from India, Indian sugar, or by abolishing the slave trade, or he must set San Domingo for himself. If he could get San Domingo, the balance in the Caribbean would be restored. San Domingo would be a noble compensation for the loss of America and a glorious addition to the domain, navigation, trade, and manufacturing of Britain. It would give Britain a monopoly on sugar, indigo, cotton, and coffee. This island for ages would give such aid and force to industry as would be most happily felt in the very parts of the kingdom. Followed by an offensive and defensive alliance with Britain and Spain, such friendships for ages might preclude France and America from the New World and effectually secure the invaluable possession of Spain. But if Pitt captured San Domingo, the slave trade must continue. When San Domingo was lost to France, the slave trade became merely a humanitarian question. The destruction of San Domingo meant the end of the French sugar trade. Not all the decrees of councils, white or black, wrote Eden with complacency, would fill up the gaps of the population of the island. But the ruin of San Domingo did not mean the salvation of the British Caribbean. Two new enemies appeared on the scene. Cuba forged ahead to fill the gap left in the world market by the disappearance of San Domingo. Bonaparte, defeated in his attempt to recapture the lost colony and determined to conquer England by strangulation of her trade, gave the first impetus to beet sugar, and the War of the Two Sugar began. Whilst under the American flag, Cuba and other natural sugars still found a market in Europe. British Caribbean island surplus piled up in England. Bankruptcies were the order of the day. Between 1799 and 1807, 65 plantations in Jamaica were abandoned. 32 were sold for debt. And in 1807, suits were pending against 115 others. Death, diseases, and death were the only topic of conversation in the island. A parliamentary committee set up in 1807 discovered that the British Caribbean planters was producing at a loss. In 1800, his profit was 2.5%. In 1807, nothing. In 1787, the planters got 19 to 6. It says the profit per hundredweight. In 1799, 10, and it says 90. In 1803, 6. I don't know what the D means. I don't know. In 1805, 11. In 1806, nothing. The committee contributed to the main evil, to the unfavorable state of the foreign market. In 1806, the surplus of sugar in England amounted to 6,000 tons. Production had to be curtailed. To restrict production, the slave trade must be abolished. The saturated colonies needed only 7,000 slaves a year. It was the new colonies crying out for labor, full of possibilities that had to be restrained, and they were permanently crippled by abolition. That explains the support of the abolition bill by so many Caribbean planters of the older islands. Ellis had stated categorically in 1804 that the slave trade should be continued, but only to the older colonies. It was the same old conflict between saturated planters and the planters on the make. The War of Bonaparte's continental blockade made abolition imperative if the older colonies were to survive. Are they not are they not now? Asked Prime Minister Grenville, distressed by the accumulation of produce on their hands for which they cannot find a market, and it will not therefore be added to their distress, and leading the planters on to their ruin, if you suffer the continuation of fresh importation. Wilberforce rejoiced. Caribbean distress could not be imputed to abolition. Actually, abolition was the direct result of that distress. If abolition of the slave trade was the solution of the planters' problems, it was only a temporary solution. For as Merivale argued, secondly, without imports to replace their slaves, the Caribbean, and especially the newer colonies, could not hope to sustain the still fiercer competition of the 19th century, slavery without the slave trade, as rather a loss than a gain. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the sugar planters were not better off than they had been before. India was still a rival to be feared, and the one devil of San Domingo was replaced by three: Mauritania, Cuba, Brazil. Sugar cultivation was later extended to Louisiana, Australia, Hawaii, and Java. Beet continued to progress until its major victory in 1848, when it freed the slaves on the cane sugar plantations of the French colonies, which it became later a permanent European and even an American feature in the interest of autocracy. I'm going to look up that word. Just real quick. Thanks for whoever's staying. Autarky, economic independence of complete self-sufficient. Between 1793 and 1883, the imports of sugar into Britain more than doubled. Complete records of the same period of the West Caribbeans were lacking. But between 1815 and 1839, Caribbean production was stationary. 3,381,700 hogsheads in 1815, 3,351,800 in 1833, with a maximum of 4,068,000 in 1828. It is significant that this level of production was maintained only at the expense of the older islands with the exhausted soil. Between 1813 and 1833, Jamaica's production declined by nearly 1/6. The exports of Antigua, Nevis, and Tobago by more than 1/4, St. Kitts by nearly 1/2, St. Lucians by 2/3, St. Vincent by 1/6, Grenada's by almost 1/8. Dominica's exports showed a slight increase, while Barbados almost doubled its exports. On the other hand, the output of the newer colonies increased. British Guiana by 2.5 times, Trinidad by 1/3. Mauritius, I can't say it, leads further confirmation to this law of slave production. Its exports to Britain, less than Antigua's in 1820, were over 4 times Antigua's in 1833. East Indian sugar sold in England increased 28 times between 1791 and 1833. Foreign sources were arising as suppliers of raw material Britain needed for refining, consumption, and export. Singapore exports in 1833 were 6 times those of 1827. Imports from the Philippines quadrupled. From Java increased more than 20 times. Cuban sugar production increased more than 40 times between 1775 and 1865. British imports from Brazil increased 7-fold between 1817 and 1831. From Cuba, 6-fold between 1817 and 1832. Sugar production as we have seen, is more efficient on the larger plantations than on the smaller one. But the size of the plantation is limited by one factor: transportation. The cane within the specified time after it has been cut must be taken to the factory. more than any other British island, Jamaica in the 18th century was the land of the sugar planters. But in 1753, there were only 3 plantations in the 2,000-acre class in Jamaica, which had about 1/10 of the land in cane. The largest belonging to Philip Pinnacock, and called by Pittman the show place of Jamaica of that day, contained 2,872 acres, of which 242 were in cane, employed 280 slaves, and produced 184 tons of sugar a year. After emancipation, Jamaica was faced with a shortage of labor, and wages rose. The island was unable to compete with the more extensive and more fertile soil of Cuba, with its slave plantation population. The development of railroads, the first was constructed in Cuba in 1837, enabled the Cuban planters to enlarge his plantation, increasing his output and reducing his cost of production, while the Jamaican planters was still asking for protection and labor. The competition thereby became more unequal. In 1860, we read of monsters plantations in Cuba, the largest comprised of 11,000 acres, of which over 1/10 was in cane, employed 866 slaves, and producing 2,670 tons of sugar a year. The British Caribbean was clearly lost their monopoly of sugar cultivation. Yeah. In 1789, they could not compete with San Domingue, nor in 1820 with Mauritius, nor in 1830 with Brazil, nor in 1840 with Cuba. Their day had passed, limited to an extent, slave or free. They could not compete with larger areas, more fertile, less exhausted, where slavery was still profitable. Cuba could contain all the British islands of the Caribbean, Jamaica included. One of Brazil's mighty rivers could hold all the Caribbean islands, all the West Caribbean islands, without its navigation being obstructed. India could produce enough rum to drown the Caribbean. The Caribbean situation was aggravated by the fact that production was in excess of the home consumption. This surplus, estimated at 25%, had to be sold to European markets in competition with cheaper Brazilian and Cuban sugar. This could be done by only subsidizing the bounties the West people who, as we have seen, were some of Britain's best customers. Between 1824 and 1829, the import of Cuban and Brazilian sugar into Hamburg increased by 10%, while those unto Prussia doubled. Cuban sugar import by Russia increased by 50%, and the Brazilian by 25% in the same period. To the capitalists, this was intolerable. Overproduction in 1807 demanded abolition. Overproduction in 1833 demanded emancipation. As far as the amount of production of sugar is concerned, State Stanley, sponsor of the emancipation measures, I am not quite certain that, to some extent, the diminution of that production would be a matter of regret. I am not quite certain that it might not be for the benefit of the planters and of the colonies themselves. In the end, if the production were to be diminished. A century before, British had complained of Caribbean underproduction. Now they were complaining of Caribbean overproduction. Common sense alone would show that the emancipation of black people would remain on the plantation only where they had no choice. In fact, comparing the years 1839 to 1842 with the years 1831 to 1834, the production of Jamaica and Grenada declined by 1/2, British Guiana by 3/5, St. Vincent by 2/5, Trinidad by 1/5, and other islands proportionately. In justification of emancipation, it was argued that the restriction of production would give the planters a real monopoly of the home market by equating production with home consumption. This was parliamentary strategy. Every effort was being made to make Caribbean cultivation as expensive, expansive as possible. In 1832, the Trinidad Council petitioned for the abolition of the slave tax of £1 island currency per head. The colonial office refused. It was, quote, of very great importance that this tax should be continued instead of rendering slave labor cheaper. It is desirable to render it dearer. The issue at stake was the monopoly itself. It was only the Caribbean monopoly which restricted the full development of British trade in sugar with all the world. Monopoly therefore must be destroyed. In 1836, monopoly was modified by emitting East Indian sugar of equal terms. In 1846, the year of the repeal of the Corn Law, the sugar duties were equalized. The British Caribbean colonies were therefore forgotten until the Panama Canal reminded the world of their existence, and revolts where their underpaid free workers made them front page news. Chapter 9. Hold on a second. What's this? Oh. British capitalism and the Caribbeans. They use West Indies, but we're using Caribbean. What time is it? We're doing good. All right, British capitalism in the West. Whereas before, in the 18th century, every import vested in interest in England was lined up on the side of monopoly and the colonial system after 1783. One by one, every one of those interests came out against monopoly in the West and the Caribbean slave system. British exports to the world were in manufactured goods, which could be paid for only in raw materials. The cotton of the United States, the cotton, coffee, and sugar of Brazil, the sugar of Cuba, the sugar and cotton in India, the expansion of British exports depended on the capacity of Britain to absorb the raw material as payment. The British Caribbean monopoly prohibited the importation of non-British plantation sugar for home consumption, stood in the way. Every important vested interest, the cotton manufacturers and the ship owners and sugar refiners, very important industrial and commercial towns, London, Manchester, Liverpool, Brigham, Sheffield, and West Riding of Yorkshire, joined in the attack on Caribbean slavery and Caribbean monopoly. The abolitionists significantly concentrated their attacks on the industrial centers. A. The cotton manufacturers. My back. The West Caribbean planters in the 18th century were both exports of raw cotton and importers of cotton manufacturers. In both respects, as we have seen, they had become increasingly negligible. The steam engine and the cotton gin changed Manchester's indifference into downright hostility. As early as 1788, Wilberforce exulted at the fact that the liberal subscription towards abolition had been raised in Manchester. Deeply interested in the African trade, Manchester was unrepresented in the House of Commons before 1832, so its parliamentary denunciation of the Caribbean system comes only after that date. But the seat of the cotton industry was interested in the problem before 1832. In 1830, Cobbett, the workers' champion, presented himself as a candidate for the constituency of Manchester. His opposition to the landed interest would have endeared him to the later seat of the Anti-Corn Law League. The test came on his attitude of the Caribbean slavery. Cobbett hated Wilberforce and the Methodists. When he fled to the United States in 1818, he wrote a letter to Orator Hunt, in which he stated that America had, quote, no Wilberforce. Think of that, no Wilberforce. The Methodists were, quote, the vilest crew God ever suffered to infest the earth. And he encouraged the people to pelt them with rotten eggs. In his opinion, the slaves were, quote, fat and lazy inwards, laughing from morning till night. The slave owners men, as gentle and as generous and as good as ever breathed. The Caribbean monopoly cost the English people nothing. Manchester turned him down, and his conversion to the cause name came too late. Manchester was openly in favor of the campaign on behalf of the East Indian sugar. In May 4th, 1821, the Manchester Chamber of Commerce presented a petition of the House of Commons, deprecating a preference to one colonial over another colony, particularly a preference to the settlement of slaves over a nation of free men. In 1833, Manchester advocated for the admission of Brazilian sugar for refining. Mark Phillips, its representative of the Parliament, spoke briefly but tersely on the vast importance of the subject to the great seat of the cotton manufacture, which he represented. He emphasized the hardship imposed on ships having to return from Brazil without cargoes and argued that the encouragement of sugar refining would increase employment for the industrious laboring classes. In this single name, Phillips is summed up the whole evolution of Manchester and its cotton industry. In 1749, the firm of J.N. Phillips, the company was deeply engaged in the Caribbean trade. In 1832, Mark Phillips was elected as one of the two members to represent Manchester for the first time in the Reformed Parliament. Phillips' Caribbean connections still persisted. A relative of Robert Hibbert, he was selected by the latter as one of the first broad board of trustees to administer the Robert Herbert Trust. But economically, his connections with the Caribbeans were over. He was opposed to the foul blot of slavery, and a sentiment which cheered at the dinner given in the town to celebrate his election. Mr. Hadfield's eloquent humanitarianism on the same occasion invoked loud applause. I appeal to you, if liberty could possibly be enjoyed by any rational men without the desire to communicate it to others, shall the mere distinction of black and white forever cause one race to be slaves while the other is free? Shall it always be that one man should be a slave because he is black and another be free because he is white? I tell you that until we wash out this foul population from the institutions of our country, liberty itself is not safe anywhere. The foul population was not slavery, but monopoly. Manchester was interested not only in the Holy Scriptures, but in the census returns. After 1833, the Manchester capitalists were all for free trade in sugar, which meant slave-grown sugar. Phillips supported the equalization of the East Indian sugar duties. The planters had their compensation, should not get a farthing more. In 1839, he was for the equalization of the duties on all foreign sugar, for it was the duty of the Parliament to lower the prices of all the necessities of life and afford every encouragement to the valuable trade with Brazil. John Bright and Milner Gibson, who at one time was vice president of the Board of Trades, held the free trade flag aloft. They argued that the protected duties of the Caribbean forces of the British working class to pay higher prices for sugar and so took away from them the money earned in the factories. They called the duty an obnoxious tax, a species of parliamentary charity, which was more than the cost of production. If the Brazilians could grow sugar for nothing, if their sugar rained down from the skies, if the Caribbean planters had stolen their sugar, it would have made no difference. Protection, said John Bright, was an opiate, which made the planters everlasting grumblers, like Oliver Twist, always asking for more. The cotton manufacturers, he boasted, asked for no protection and needed none, convincingly getting the protection they had asked for a century and a half earlier against indigenous goods, and ignorant of the protection they would ask for 3/4 of the century later against Japanese textiles. The free traders, Bright warned, might be defeated, but they would return to the charge with renewed energy. The planters demand their impundent. It was not the duty of the Parliament to make sugar cultivation profitable, and Bright advised them to grow cloves, and nutmeg. B. Who's in here? Or you could try, but I don't have anybody here. Aisha, we can try, but I don't think you're going to get anybody. B. The Iron Masters. As early as 1788, the Abolition Society was started in Birmingham, and a liberal subscription collected for the cause. In this society, the Iron Masters were prominent. 3 of the Lloyd family, with their banking interests as well, were on the committee. The dominant figure, however, was Samuel Garrett. Garrett was an outstanding figure of the Industrial Revolution, more reminiscent of the 20th than the 18th century. In his breadth of vision, the scope of his activities, the multiplicity of his interests, he reminds us of Samuel Touchett, a partner in the spinning enterprise of Watt and Paul. Garbutt was an associate of Roebuck's in the Carry-On Works, a shareholder with Bolton and Watts in the Albion Mills, and in the copper mines of Cornwall. There were indeed, writes Ashton, few sides of industrial and commercial life of his day that he did not touch. In addition, his energy was thrown into the politics of industry, rather than into the details of administration. He became an ironmaster spokesman to the government. This was a dangerous man indeed to have as an opponent, for Garbutt, in the large sense, was Birmingham. At the meeting of many respectable inhabitants of Birmingham in January 28, 1788, Samuel Garbutt presiding, it was decided to send a petition to Parliament. The petition stated, inter alia, that, quote, is as inhabitants of a manufacturing town and neighborhood, your petition have the commercial interests of this kingdom very deeply at heart, but cannot conceal their detestation of any commerce which always originates in violence and too often terminates in cruelty. Gaston Visa, an African visited Birmingham and received a sympathetic welcome. This was not to say that Birmingham was anonymous or single-minded on the issues of abolition. The manufacturers, still interested in the slave trade, held counter meetings and sent counter petitions to Parliament. Samuel Garbutt and the Lloyds and others of that caliber were, from the Caribbean standpoint, on the wrong side of the fence. In 1832, Birmingham was a center of the agitation which, led by the Iron Master Atwood, brought England to the verge of revolution and culminated in the Reform Bills of 1832. Again, the town was divided on the emancipation issue. A public meeting held in the Assembly Room of the Royal Hotel on April 16, 1833, was a noisy and turbulent character and ended in disorder. The proprietors claimed damage for broken chairs and glass. Birmingham was one of the many industrial centers which voted in 1833 for a shorter period of apprenticeship, under which, by the Emancipation Act, black slaves was perpetuated in a modified form. Joseph Sturge was a prominent figure in the emancipation struggle. After 1833, Sturge took the lead in England in protest against the apprenticeship system, with the abolition gurney. He sailed to the Caribbean in 1836 with the benevolent idea of making personal inquiries as to the state of the black population in the hopes of obtaining further ameliorations of their conditions. His safe return the following years was celebrated by a public breakfast in his honor at the town hall in appreciation of his unwearying philanthropic exertion in the case of black emancipation. This was the 19th century and no longer 18th century. Birmingham and yet another vested interest had turned against the colonial system. Sheffield, the center of the steel industry, might profitably be considered with Birmingham. Sheffield's interest in the colonial system had at most been slight, with no vested interest in maintenance of colonial slavery. It offered a favorable field for abolitionists. Sheffield, like Manchester, Birmingham, and other centers of industry, was unprecedented in parliaments before 1832. It formed a part of the country of York, whose representatives was first Wilberforce and then Burham, both outstanding abolitionists. I am an advocate for the abolition of the Caribbean slavery, campaigned Burham in the town in 1830, and both root and branch I will tear it up. I have loosened it already, and if you will assist me, I will brandish it over your heads. Some part of Sheffield's assistance can be attributed to his interest in the East. In 1825, the abolitionists began to boycott the Caribbean produce and urged the consumption instead of the sugar rum of India. Sheffield was the center of this movement. The Auxiliary Society was formed in the same year for the relief of black slaves. The committee organized as though campaigned in the town. The committee organized and thorough campaign in the town. Each member took, excuse me. Each member took 2 streets in order to make a canvass as to the predictability of inducing housekeepers to adopt the use of East Indian produce. The committee estimated that for every 6 families who use East Indian sugar, 1 slave less was required in the Caribbean. Obviously a far-fetched argument, but any stick was good enough for beating the Caribbean so long as the Caribbeans were beaten. Surely the committee urged their fellow townsmen to release the fellow creatures from the state of cruel bondage and misery. Why so small a sacrifice is worthy the attention of all. Sheffield rose to the occasion and the sale of East Indian sugar doubled in 6 months. In May 1833, the Anti-Slavery Society of the town forwarded a memorial to the Prime Minister urging immediate rather than gradual emancipation. To the end, it protested against compensations to the slave owners and the apprenticeship scheme. And Sheffield, like Birmingham, voted ultimately for terminating the apprenticeship in the shortest possible time. Oh, let's see here. I'm gonna look ahead real quick. Stay on 158. Let me see here. Okay, I'll do that. 158. The woolen industry. The woolen industry, too, joined the chorus of opposition. Wilberforce in Burham spoke not only for the humanitarians, but also for the woolen centers. Was the House asked by Mr. Strickland of Yorkshire in 1833 to take freedom of commerce and the extension of the employment of capital as the rule in legislating, or was it to increase monopolies by restrictions? He gave the answer himself. All monopolies ought to be removed, as destructive to the progress of commerce. John Bright, a cotton, Samuel Garrett, an iron. These were mighty names, to be joined by one mightier still, speaking for the woolen industry, Richard Cobden. one on the question of the Caribbean monopoly, and the e- evangelists evangelists of free trade and the leader of anti-corn law league spoke with vigor, a logic and a popular support that were irresistible. The Caribbeans claimed to the monopoly was in principle an odyssey. Wait, audacity. Yeah, I think that is. There was a time thundered Cobden restricting the shades of the longer Parliament in Charles I, where no members would have dared to raise in Parliament to make a claim on the ground of monopoly. Men of business were calculated the cost. It could not be expected to be satisfied if they found themselves paying half as much in expense as the whole value of colonial trade. And Britain had made a present to the planters for her exports in return for free trade in Brazil and Cuba. She would actually have gained. Then, what sort of trade was this? It was precisely as if a shopkeeper should give, with every pound's worth of goods, have a sovereign to his customer. Oh, souvenir. Wait, that's not souvenir. That's sovereign. Sovereign. Yeah, it's sovereign to his customers. That's weird. The House of Commons conducted business with less wisdom than was required for the successful management of the Chandler House. On the argument of the deferential duties in favor of the West Caribbean sugar was intended to prohibit the consumption of slave-growing sugar. Cobden poured weathering scorn. What right had the people who were the largest distributors of textiles to go to Brazil with their ships full of cotton goods, manufactured from slave-grown materials, and then turn up the whites of their eyes, shed crocodile tears over the slaves and refuse to take slave-grown sugar in return? The situation was I don't know this word. Farcical. Farcical. I don't know if that's the word. I doubt it.
Farcical.
I was right. Farcical. Holy shit. Something so ridiculous, absurd, exaggerated, or disorganized that it cannot be taken seriously. Okay. And Cobden wrote a skit on it in the form of an imaginary interview at the Board of Trade between Lord Ripon and the Brazilian ambassador. Ambassador taunts the embarrassed Lord Ripon. No religious sculptures against sending slave-grown cotton into every country in the world. No religious scruples against eating slave-grown rice. No religious scruples against smoking slave-grown tobacco. No religious scruples against taking slaves' ground snuff. Am I to understand that the religious scruples of the British people are confined to articles of sugar? Ripon, obviously uncomfortable, reiterates his inability to take Brazilian sugar and pleads in defense the promptings of the anti-slavery party led by Joseph Sturgis. At this moment, in walks Sturge with a cotton cravat, a hat lined with calico, a coat sewn with cotton threads, pockets well lined with slave wrought gold and silver. The two diplomats burst into laughter. Logic, if not humanity, was on Cobden's side. So was the anti-slavery party. The party he boosted with justice, had its strength and headquarters in the industrial towns and was now in the ranks of the Corn Law repealers. He and they spoke with one voice. I am the representative of the woolen industry, he asserted in 1848. An indigenous indigenous industry of which there is no jealousy in the house. I am the representative of the country which was imminent in the slavery movement. Now I am unhesitantly asserting that nearly all the men who lead the agitation for the emancipation of the slaves, and who, by their influence on public opinion, aided by producing that result, are against those honed gentlemen in this house who advocate the differential duties of foreign sugar, with a view to put down slavery abroad. Hold on a second, we'll look at something else. 160. I think we're going to stop here. Liverpool and Glasgow. Just going over the abolition stuff, and they're trying to make it so that there's no... They're doing it for their own goods. They're doing it because they're not doing it to really actually free. They're doing it to actually... They're doing it for their own reasons. What page? 160. They're doing it for their own self-interest. There's somewhat a self-interest in this. All right. How many more paragraphs do we got going? Hold on. Oh my God. 160. Come on. Let's see. Table of contents. We're on. Which one are we on? We were on. No, we did the new industrial order. I think we're on 9. British capitalism in the Caribbeans. Yeah. So we have 3 more chapters to go. Well, 4 more chapters to go. So we'll be good. And I might pick up something from Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, which is the same person but different times of development. All right. I think that was great. I know I'm only reading for an hour these days, but I'm so tired. I have this kitty cat, the little boy, to keep going, huh, baby boy? Yeah. So, but anyways, everybody, I hope everybody had a good day, and I hope everybody's going to have a good night. I wish you all a good night.